Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Joining us back on the program today is Gail Woodard. For those of you who have been listening to our series of interviews when it comes to publishing books, she's from Dudley Court Press. And if there's anything that our guest knows, it's how daunting a book project can be. As she spent years as a strategic planner, marketer, and educator, usually well-suited to coaching and guiding both authors as well as a team of professionals at Dudley Court Press, and is also personally involved with every book project that comes her way. She's going to be talking with us today about something that's very special and should be near and dear to pretty much everybody to kind of leave a legacy, if you will, out on the world, and that is writing a memoir, which is a good record of memories, both joyous and unpleasant. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, writing your memoir, Gail Woodard. Gail, thank you for being back on the program today.
Well, thanks for having me back, Dan. It's always a pleasure.
Now, memoirs, we all know what these are, but most people would think, well, I'm not famous. I've never done anything maybe significant, but why should people write memoirs?
Well, I think people should write memoirs because I believe that stories about that people want to know where they came from. They want to know more about who their parents were, their grandparents were. I know I have that fascination, and I talk to people all the time who will say to me, I wish that I had captured the stories my grandfather used to tell or my grandmother used to tell, and now they're gone, and I don't remember all of those stories. So I think it's a way to connect with who we are and where we've come from.
And it's interesting when you think about writing a memoir, too, you hit it right on the head, is, you may not feel that perhaps your story is significant, but you may have a piece of a puzzle that a family member or friend or whatever the case may be is actually looking for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You never know when a particular memory is meaningful, to one of your children or grandchildren, or they've heard segments of a story, but when you tell them the background to it, it's really fascinating, what happens when people see the depth about who you are when you've written your memoirs.
So I guess the first thing is our listeners are listening, what's the best way to get started?
The best way to get started is to start. So whether you write on a computer or on a, sorry about that noise, on a computer, or you take pencil and paper, or you have a journal, whatever your favorite way is to write, or you can, another great way is to talk, to record your memories. We can talk more about that, but just to start. And, it can be a little overwhelming. So what I suggest to people is they start by listing all the story ideas that come to them first. So maybe not starting out, I was born, in a van down by the river kind of thing, but
gotcha.
But rather saying, these are the categories or the story ideas that would be kind of fun for me to talk about, and make a list of all the possible stories that you might want to write, and then pick one. And just pick that one person you want to write about or incident you want to write about. And, of course, as you start to write, you get more and more ideas.
It only makes sense to begin writing, and then just kind of after a while, these things will actually kind of come out of people, won't they?
Yes. Yeah. The hardest part, I find with people who start writing their memoirs, one of the challenges is the question becomes, well, when do I stop?
Or another one might be, I seem to be writing a lot about my family's dirty laundry. What do I do instead of that?
Well, yeah. And sometimes writing memoirs becomes a therapeutic exercise for the person writing, and that can be wonderfully healing. It's a great way to explore your feelings or your experiences of life and try to understand them better. That may not be a memoir that you ultimately want to make public, but that's okay. The ultimate goal for for writing, things can change. You think you're writing a story or memoir to share with your family, and then you realize that maybe it's just helping you clear out some old baggage, and it's better to burn it all once you're done with it.
Now, here's something I've been always intrigued by. What would be the difference between, for instance, an autobiography, which is basically someone writing their own life story, and a memoir? Because to me, they seem almost like they're the same thing.
Well, there's some overlap, but an autobiography technically is the complete collection of all the facts of a person's life, and those all the historical facts and details that one would write about oneself. That's much more interesting if you're an important person and you're creating the autobiography so that future historians will have the facts that they want in order to compile a historical record of who you are, who you were, what you did, where you were when you did this, that, or the other thing. A memoir is a slice of remembrances, and you could be someone who writes several memoirs. You can take a slice of your life, a period of your life, your time in college, your time in the Army, your time. There are a lot of memoirs written about folks and their experiences in World War II, for example, which may not cover their entire life. Maybe there's a little bit of their childhood and a little bit after their experiences in World War II, but most of the story is, what they did during the war. And that's a memoir. It's not an autobiography.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. Because I remember back probably about 16, 17 years ago when I was at a radio station, actress Mariel Hemingway, I had her come in, and hers was a memoir. And now when you say that, it makes sense because she was mostly in her memoir talking about her acting career and lessons learned because she was also infusing what yoga had brought to her life.
Uh-huh.
Which each chapter was sort of saying this particular pose is this, and she'd begin and then talk about a segment like you were talking about of her life rather than her entire life. So I get it.
Right.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it can also be a theme that works through your life. A memoir could be totally focused on your experiences, let's say, as a runner, and it may have started when you raced your brothers and sisters, when you were a little kid, and then on to high school track, and then college, and then the Olympics, and then the this and that, whatever. But it's about the running aspects of your life, and it has nothing to do with your work or your artistic creations or your relationships, other than outside of that particular theme. So there are different ways to craft memoir.
Absolutely. I find it interesting, too, as I was saying earlier in the program, to make that decision to write a memoir, but then people might think, well, my life doesn't really feel that it's all that exciting, and whether or not it's worth it for them to write memoirs. What do you say to something like that?
Well, I think the question of whether it's worth it for you to write your memoirs is only a question that you can answer, because it does take time and it takes energy. It takes some commitment to get it done. And like anything, if it's not worth it to you, if there's not some kind of payoff for you, you probably aren't going to do it, and you're certainly not going to enjoy doing it. So if you don't have a why, a reason that motivates you, then I say, don't do it. Now, if your life hasn't been you think your life hasn't been very exciting, but you still want to write. You still would like to write your memoirs. The thing to remember is it doesn't have to be about exotic places and exotic people and famous anything. The lessons, the experiences that you had, whoever you are meaningful because they're your life. I want to share one little example that I think is very telling. If you're sort of an average person, you've lived your life, and now you want to write some memoirs, but there's nothing terribly exciting to talk about. my mother wrote her memoirs when she was in her 80s, and I published them for her a few years ago. And one of the stories that came back from one of her great-grandchildren, he was a young fellow, about 12 or 14, when he read her book, her memoirs. And the thing he said was, I really enjoyed getting to know great-grandma as a young person, as a little girl. The stories that she wrote about her summer adventures in New Hampshire, playing with her brother in the wood piles, and that their experiences, it was just normal living. It was nothing exotic. But this 12 or 14-year-old great-grandson said, I always thought of her as just an old lady, but now I see she was young once.
Isn't that funny how that works?
Yeah, isn't that funny? I mean, it just created some depth to the relationship. So I think that's something to consider. If you want to be remembered by your great-grandchildren or your grandchildren as somebody other than grandma or grandpa, you can provide some context to or some insight into who you were as a young person.
And that's also a good point for people to come to grips with is when you think about, for instance, Grandma writing about her playing in the woodpile in New Hampshire, for instance, as a child, and this 12-year-old had read this and realized, wow, that was quite enjoyable to read, is when you think about the all-time classic, The Little Rascals, Our Gang. And the fact is all that was film showing kids just doing day-to-day things. And I remember watching, for instance, sort of a documentary on this, and the person who actually created The Little Rascals found, there it was right in front of him, something for him to film and to put on television to watch, because what he found himself fascinated by was that he was watching kids doing kid things, and that he was so engripped and engulfed in it for 15 plus 20 minutes or something like that, and time just flew, and he realized there's the idea right there, just film kids seemingly just doing ordinary things. And so when you have that thing that says, well, I don't really know if I should write this because my life isn't terribly exciting, the fact is what's really enjoyable to a lot of people is that everyday, average, and ordinary existence, because that's something most people connect with. Yeah.
And also, if you're listening to this and you're over the age of 60, remember that your kids and grandkids are growing up in a world that's really different from the world you grew up in. When you talk about how you communicate with people, that we didn't have cell phones, and you'd have to go find a payphone. And if you're older than that, you remember the times, when their phones were a real luxury. You didn't have a phone in never mind a phone in every pocket, but you didn't have a phone in every house. You may have had to go down the road to your neighbor's house, or you had a party line, or things that were that children today or young people today growing up have no concept of what life was like 50, 70 years ago. And sharing those little things about the kind of clothes that you wore, the kind of food you ate, the kind of transportation that what a day at school was like. It's really a window onto a different world. And when someone reads it and they know you, and so they know it was your experience, it's much more interesting than just sort of reading that on an impersonal article somewhere.
Right, exactly. And then something that's usually kind of biased and shaped in the direction that the person actually wrote it is all about. So crazy how that all works. Now, a person might be thinking, well, I'm not a good writer. I'm not in the habit of writing. What do you say to that?
Well, that's a great question, because writing does take, as I said, it takes time. It takes energy. If your day is already full, you have to take something out of your day in order to make time to write. And developing a writing habit is wonderful if you're interested. So first you have to decide you're interested, you want to do this, because that's the motivation that's going to let you then carve time out of your day, and you want to have a place and a methodology that you use, whatever it is. Maybe it's you sit at the computer, maybe you write longhand, but as any writer knows, having a fairly regular schedule and a regular place makes it easier to develop the habit to sit down and write. And then one of the things I teach in my memoir course is that list that I mentioned earlier, that you create the list of all the story ideas you might at some point want to write about. That way, when you sit down to write, you're not necessarily starting with a blank piece of paper. You pick a story and think about it, and then write what you want to write about that particular story. That's much easier, than trying to. I'm going to write my memoirs, and I'm starting from scratch. So writing it in pieces, writing little vignettes, writing short pieces where maybe you decide this week I'm going to write about 5 of my aunts and uncles or my grandparents or my parents, and you just focus on those personalities and what was your grandmother like? What was special about her? What did she do in your life? How did you relate to her? And you write out that piece. Suddenly you have a chunk of your personal history that you can, you don't have to worry about it being perfectly written as you write. That's something else to be aware of if you're not a writer. It's important to know that can I go into this a little bit? This is the writing technique.
Yes.
Two kinds of writing. One is the right brain, creative, get the material out there on paper part, and the other part is the left brain editor part. And as much as possible, you want to separate those times and that work. So you create all of the material and then come back another time to edit. And that's when you clean up the language and you sort of make something flow a little bit better. But you don't worry about it when you're doing the first round of writing. The idea there is to get the ideas on paper. Even if
you'd never get anything done if you tried that technique. It's funny because I actually read, it was Stephen King's book on writing. And that's exactly what he does. He says, I just go and I just get it all out, right out there on paper. And then he says, what I do is I throw it in a drawer for 6 weeks. That's what he says to do. And then he comes back and, think about it. After 6 weeks, that's pretty much been out of your head now. Now you get to come back to it and you're fresh and you're looking at it much differently. So.
Yeah. Well, and the other reason to do it that way is that oftentimes we'll start to write and we think, I'm going to write about my Aunt Susie because she was really important to me. She took care of me a lot when I was growing up. And so you start writing about Aunt Susie and you do it in a way where the superficial images and ideas come out first. But then if you keep writing, you start to get deeper into, why was Aunt Susie around helping you out? Why wasn't she married? Or why did you start to go further into your relationship or there's all kinds of things that can happen the longer you spend with that subject. And you may find that, the first 2 pages that you wrote were, okay, but those were the basic facts. But you really got into some great, insightful stuff by the time you got to page 3. So you want to live with each little story long enough to make it get to the depth of it. That's what's kind of fun as a writer.
Now, people might also think about, well, how do I make my memoir more exciting, I guess, as we talked about earlier.
Well, to make it exciting...
Or even just more interesting, for that matter.
Part of it is your own enthusiasm for it. And your own enthusiasm for telling a story. If you're a good storyteller, then you're going to tell stories in your memoir the way you tell stories verbally. If you're not a great storyteller, then what you want to do is make sure when you go back to edit that you provide enough description of people. What you don't want to do is focus on I'm going to tell a story in how my grandmother kept journals of her trips. She did some wonderful traveling when she was in her 60s and 70s, and she kept journals. But her journals, my grandmother was a wonderful, lovely woman, but her journals were, today we went to Geneva, the lake was pretty, and we had pork and peas for dinner. That was it. So that's not very interesting. It's the idea of spending the energy to extract from an experience some kind of emotion, some kind of feeling, some kind of description. Don't just write facts. The facts are not that interesting all by themselves. That's like a genealogical record. To make a memoir interesting, you want to have some color to it. You want to have sound and touch and smell and add those things in your writing.
Now, organization is certainly something to think about in a memoir. Do you start at the beginning, the middle, the end? I mean, how do you go about deciding that?
You know, I think a lot of people think they have to start at the beginning, and I think that's a real killer for making it interesting. I would stay away from starting off with that first sentence. I was born on such and such a date in such and such a location. If you have to do that, go ahead. But I say get away from that as quickly as possible. I mean, if you spend your first day, write down all the facts, fine, put that away, and then go to your list of story ideas and pick one and spend an hour, thinking about all of the things you can remember from fourth grade. What was that all about? What was that time in your life? And maybe that wasn't the most important time. Maybe it was, ninth grade, or maybe it was your relationship with your grandmother, or maybe it was the moves that your family made while you were growing up. It doesn't matter where you start, but it's important to take a starting point and then go deep. And then when you're finished with that starting point or that theme or that subject, you can put that aside for a while and then go find another one and go deep. Don't stay superficial.
That's interesting. Never even thought about it that way before. Now, it's funny because when you put something out there like that and you're deciding, that you're going to write your memoir, you may decide to pass that around the family and you may not get certain approval, or they may say, well, I don't really want that in there. How do you deal with something like that?
Well, there are a couple of things to think about on this. I personally think that it's very important to try not to hurt people's feelings, not to write a memoir and put it out there in order to get revenge or to just show people what they're really like. Anything that smacks of that sort of attitude, I think reflects just badly on you as a person, and I know we've been approached by people with memoirs like that, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. Something to be careful about, if you think you're going to publish a memoir and put it out into the commercial marketplace, be careful about libel, because you don't want to get involved with issues around that. But I think generally most people, it has to do with inter-family relationships. And I've participated with people in memoirs where I've had to encourage them to cut a lot of commentary that seemed to serve no purpose except to make them. It was angry content that was good. They had a chance to say it in their writing, but it was only going to hurt people if it was actually published. And we'd sort of negotiate on some of that. I've been involved with people where even a slight comment created uproar with other family members. But I think what can happen is if you moderate those kinds of issues enough so that you are very conscious of not hurting people's feelings or or creating uproar that doesn't serve anyone. But I've seen it happen that someone else would then step up to the plate and write a different story or their take on the same situation. And everyone had a broader understanding of a particular person or particular circumstances. So it can be, you can say, well, I'm writing my memoir. This is the way I remember it. If you remember it differently, I invite you to write your story too. That can actually be a very healing and certainly eye-opening for everyone. I think the important thing is when you're writing something that's sensitive is to make sure that you use phrases like, this is the way I remember it. This is how it felt to me. My recollection is that. So that you're not sort of stating it as fact, you're couching it in the terms that this is how you recall the circumstances. That can help.
Now, last of all, I was going to ask, when do you think is a good time to write a memoir?
I would start today. I have a lot of people I know who were going to write their memoirs, and it's too late because they're dead or they have developed Alzheimer's or some other capacity. They're blind or something has happened to them that has made it impossible for them to write their memoirs. And they talked about it for years but didn't act. So my answer to that question is always start today. Don't wait, because you never know when it's going to be too late.
Now, how can people find out more about Dudley Court Press, and how do you suggest they get started?
Well, they can find us on the internet at dudleycourtpress.com. That's DUDLEYCOURTPRESS.com. And we do have some information in there about writing memoirs. We have a book I wrote a few years ago called Memoir Writing Made Easy. I think you can buy that on our website still. And occasionally I run a course for memoir writers. So if someone's interested, they can reach out to me through the website. There's a contact form. And just say that they're interested in the course on memoir writing, and I'll be really happy to chat with them about it.
Well, very good. Well, Gail, thank you so much for joining us back on the program today. Always interesting conversations about publishing and writing and things that you just don't think about.
Well, I love talking about writing and publishing books. I love books. I love people who write books. And I love that when people want to share their stories. I really believe that everyone has something of value to share with other people, and memoirs is a great way to do it, especially for family members.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Gail, thank you again for joining us on the program today.
Thanks so much, Dan. Great to talk to you. Bye-bye.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter to keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50, as well as our upcoming shows. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.